So what is the sexiest medieval helmet on the tier list? Coming in cold in the F tier is the Spangenhelm and the Nasal helm. The absolute basic bitches of helmet design, and while they did do a good job of protecting your head from being twatted with an axe, they left your face horribly vulnerable to being penetrated by giant members. Massively outclassed as helmet designs improved. Crapping up the C tier is the Barbute, the ugly relative of the Sallet, which is trying to cosplay as a Greek Corinthian helmet, and while it does have some swazz about it, other helmets of the period were just far superior as they fully enclosed the face and provided more flexibility and versatility with articulated pieces. Coming in at bangable at the B tier is the Kettle helmet, a fantastic budget option for those with a little less money and those who might not be fighting on the front line and are less likely to receive giant members penetrating their face. It also didn't impede your sight or vision and provided extra protection to your face and shoulders from strikes from above, such as from a cavalry attack or during a siege. Next up on the B tier, and perhaps a very controversial choice, is the Great Helm, one of the most iconic helmets of the Middle Ages and the poster boy of the Crusades. However, its functionality just wasn't it. Its flat top, which was amended in later designs, won't deflect blows against your skull away from it very well, and its snug fit on the wearer did impede their senses and provide a bit of claustrophobia for the user and lead to overheating in some cases. However, you could take this helmet off during battle as you usually did wear another helmet below it. Arse rimming up the A tier is the Frogmouth helm, an absolute masterpiece in helmet design, however you wouldn't use it on the battlefield in any circumstances. It was for the joust and an evolution on the Great Helm, as when you were stood up in the normal position, you could only see upwards out of it. However, for the joust, you'd lean forward to look at striking your opponent and then pull up at the last minute, which the Frogmouth helm was excellent for, as if you didn't pull up the last minute, the jousting lance could go straight through the visor and pluck out your brain. Also coming in at A tier is the Armet and Close helm, providing a snug hug for your face and only differing in design due to the way they opened, and it was at the peak of helmet designs, so these provided the most protection for your face with the most plates. And what's absolutely fantastic about them is some of the decorative visors they had. Imagine standing across the field of battle looking at one of these chaps ready to kill you. And before we get to S tier, honourable mention to the Sutton helmet. Imagine staring across the battlefield at this thing, fit for a king, and the decoration on it are enough to make your knees weak and get the juices flowing. And shagging up the S tier is the Sallet. You can either wear an opened face for versatility or go full protection with the visor and beaver attached. This is pure sex appeal. This is pure battlefield protection. And last but not least, sucking off the S tier is the Bascinet. You can go open face for versatility, or you can attach a visor for full facial protection, as well as chainmail aventails, and the Houndskull Bascinet is a pure medieval icon. So what is the sexiest castle defensive feature on the tier list? Coming in at F tier has to of course been the Ditch, because it's absolutely awful. No, I'm only joking. No. The real bottom of the list in D tier is crenalations, because while every castle feature is fantastic, something had to go here and these just picked the short straw. Obviously great for providing cover for your archers in between their shots, but these things just don't get the juices flowing as much as other features. Clinging on in the C tier is machiculations, great for dropping stuff on your enemy when they're hiding at the bottom of your walls so you don't have to expose yourself leaning over your crenalations. They're like a little bit of spicy castle seasoning, nice to have on your food but not essential. In a similar vein, murder holes, basically indoor machiculations but with a far cooler name, providing a hole to drop stuff on your enemy such as boiling sand or just rocks and arrows when they get inside your gatehouse. Balling up the B tier is arrow slits, because why not shoot your enemy from the comfort of your own castle without having to worry about being hit back unless they had godlike aim? And you could put these things practically anywhere in your castle so your enemy always had an angle to worry about. Also banging up the B tier is the curtain wall, because if you wanted to stop your enemy, why not just build a second wall, forcing them to now knock down two, buying you valuable time, and these things could create some nasty killing zones inside your castle. And also just a singular wall's not on the tier list because every castle needed one to basically be a castle. Sally ports are also getting the B job because while attacking your enemy is cool, attacking your enemy from a surprise door that they didn't even know about is even cooler. B/A tier is the keep, where all the daily castle action took place and the last line of defence for you, which could buy you some time in a siege, but if they had already pushed you back to the keep, it was pretty much over for you. But they do look bloody fantastic, so there's that. Angling in the A tier is towers. They come in all beautiful shapes and sizes and are absolutely essential for having a super sexy castle. They provide lookout points, higher ground, and protruding ones cover dead zones so your enemy can't hide anywhere. Also in the A tier is the gatehouse, because a giant hole in your wall should be the weakest point, but those medieval mad lads made it the most heavily defended point of the castle. There's numerous killing zones, portcullises, drawbridges, murder holes, arrow slits, crenalations, machiculations. Basically every castle feature you could name, you'd find it in the gatehouse. And the S tier is reserved for none other than the magnificent ditch, because if you didn't want your enemy getting to your castle in the first place with their siege equipment, just dig a giant hole around it and possibly fill it with water, so they'd have to waste time filling it in. And in between sieges, you could also go for a nice swim, although you probably didn't want to as this thing was filled with shit. Because as the old medieval saying went, if you make ditches, you get bitches. So what was the sexiest medieval weapon on the tier list? Stinking up the F tier is the club. Extremely basic and cheap to produce, and you could usually get a good bonk out of it on your opponents, and adding spikes inflicted additional damage, but it just doesn't get the juices flowing as much as other medieval weapons. And on the same note, the sling's also in the F tier because no one's getting excited by glorified rock throwing. Dicking into the D tier is the flail, an agricultural tool turned weapon that was used by the peasant armies of the Hussites in the early 15th century, and it was extremely cheap, required little training, and also, like the club, could produce a really good bonk, which is why these peasant armies used it. Clapping up the C tier is the spear, an absolute staple in human history as we've found that penetrating someone with a large member with a sharp point on the end is actually rather effective. It's the old reliable, but it's not the 10 out of 10 baddie we need. Accompanying the spear in the C tier is the short bow, another staple in human history, as bows are rather good because you don't have to be near someone to kill them. However, it's just missing that little bit of spice that we need that may be provided by weapons we mention later on. And that later on is now as coming in at the B tier is the crossbow, an excellent ranged weapon to use on the defence such as during a siege, and while it did have a lower rate of fire than the bows, its penetrating power was excellent and required very little training to use, as you just had to pull a trigger, and it was even condemned by the Pope in 1139 for being hateful towards God. Also banging in the B tier is the Goedendag, a weapon I've probably horribly mispronounced because it's Flemish, and it was part club, part spear, and it had its moment of fame during the Battle of Golden Spurs in 1302, when a bunch of Flemish peasants absolutely sent some French knights packing. And being English, I'm always fond of something that sends the French knights packing, so this gets the B tier. And B for battle axe, a brutally terrifying savage weapon, especially the two-handed ones, because imagine a giant man with a two-handed axe ready to cleave you in half. That would be absolutely terrifying on the battlefield, with it also having the versatility to be a one-handed weapon where you could add a few spikes to it. Now I've put the mace between B and A tier, because it's got the brutality and the raw sex appeal. It could crush a man's chest in beneath their armour, but look hot as fuck in doing so, as these things were often lavishly decorated. In the A tier is the sword, a medieval icon and the weapon of the knight. Elegant, yet effective. It had variations of one-handed ones, two-handed ones, and it evolved over time as armour improved, and you needed a better weapon to cleave through your opponent. Another weapon in the A tier that came about as armour improved is the Warhammer. You've got your hammer side to twat someone silly through their armour, or you could flip it around to this sharp point and have the penetrating power of a group of lads in Magaluf. Or you could use it as a hook to get your opponent off balance. And in the S tier is the Polearms, a generally very broad term for a wide array of two-handed shafted weapons. But that's what the medieval battlefield was for, swinging around giant sharp members. They rose in prominence as armour making was reaching its pinnacle, as they provided a wide array of utility. You had blades to cut, hammers to bonk, and sharp points to penetrate. And finally, super duper S tier, the English longbow, a national treasure, Henry V's love child. Nothing beats it. So what was the sexiest piece of medieval siege equipment on the tier list? Flogging up the F tier is the Onager, a torsion-powered catapult that only saw use in the very early medieval period, and it was more of a Roman thing that soon got replaced when something better came along. Climbing into the D tier is the siege ladder, an effective piece of equipment for what it did and was pretty much used in every siege ever. However, it left the attacker horribly vulnerable to the defenders above. These things were the equivalent of vegetables on your plate at dinner time. Necessary, but no one's getting excited over them. Clapping up the C tier is the traction trebuchet, or the mangonel, which replaced the Onager, and its ability to yeet stones to break fortifications, body parts to terrify your enemy, or rotting animal carcasses to spread disease made it quite the staple in most medieval sieges up until the 12th century. However, as it had to be operated by people instead of a mechanism, and its limited range meaning it had to be placed close to the castle walls, it left these people vulnerable to the ranged attacks from the defenders, so it had to work in tandem with your ranged units and siege shields, and it only doesn't get higher because of its hotter evolution, which I'll mention later. Also digging in at the C tier is Sappers, because while undermining your enemy's walls to collapse its foundations could be really effective, it was also rather easy for the enemy to countermine you back and collapse your tunnels before you collapse their walls. Banging into the B tier is the giant crossbow or Balista, because nothing was better than penetrating your enemy with a giant 2-meter long member, and this thing could break down wooden fortifications quite easily as well, but it was probably better on the defence as it wouldn't help you break down these big stone castle walls, but it would probably be quite scary to be on the receiving end of. Mantlets or portable shields are also in the B tier. They're not super sexy, gorgeous, attractive, but they're bloody efficient at what they do. They can cover your archers or cover your siege equipment, and you can keep moving them up to get closer to the enemy without getting struck by a crossbow bolt. Maybe not the sexiest thing you've ever taken home, but it gets the job done. Also lighting up the B tier is Greek fire, or medieval napalm, and after an incident in 1191 during the Siege of Acre, when the Crusaders got their siege towers burnt down by Greek fire on the brink of victory, they had a vile hatred for it, because it burnt with such an intensity that it couldn't be put out. But it also doesn't see much use outside the Byzantines or the Crusades, as it was a closely guarded Byzantine secret where we're still not sure today how they 100% made it back then. B for battering ram the gate and wall banger. Cover it with shields and you're now resistant against projectiles. Cover it in vinegar and it's now fire resistant. A great piece of kit you'd need at every single siege. However, you would have to fill in the enemy's ditch first before you could use it. Appetising in the A tier is the siege tower. Similar to the ram, you'd have to fill in your opponent's ditch first before you pushed it to the walls, but once it got moving it was a mobile fortress. You could have archers on the top to clear out the wall before it landed, and once it did land, if you got a few of them on your opponent's walls, they'd be pretty easy to capture. Smashing it up in the S tier is the counterweight trebuchet. These sexy beasts revolutionised medieval siege warfare as they could launch 100-kilogram projectiles over 200 metres, and while the torsion trebuchet did do some damage to an opponent's wall, the counterweight trebuchet could bring down the entire wall, leading to a revolution in castle building where walls were made thicker to deal with this thing. Snuggling up to the trebuchet in S tier is the cannon, also revolutionising siege warfare, seeing the decline of castles towards star forts in order to deal with these massive beasts. As well as physical damage, they also inflicted huge psychological damage on the enemy with their massive roars, and their role at the siege of Constantinople in 1453 arguably changed the medieval world forever. So who was the sexiest medieval warrior unit on the tier list? Frogging up the F tier is the French Knight. Turn to any page in a history book and you'll probably find these chaps overconfidently charging to their demise, and most horrifically of all, they're French. Dying in the D tier is the Genoese crossbowman, mercenary used by many armies during the Middle Ages because having ranged units was quite a good idea. However, when they weren't hiding behind castle walls, they were quite reliant on their pavise shields to cover them while reloading, and at the Battle of Crécy in 1346, these things got left on the baggage train way back as they got ordered into battle, and they had to fight the English longwomen completely naked and got a good spanking because of it. Also dogging in the D tier are the housecarls, bodyguards and retainers of the Scandinavian and Saxon kings who swung their giant members around with enough force to cleave a man in two. Most memorably making up the backbone of the Saxon army at the Battle of Hastings, they loyally fought to their death to fulfil their oaths even after their king Harold Godwinson got kebabbed by an arrow. Moving up into the C tier is the housecarls of a Mediterranean glow-up, the Varangian Guard. They were the elite bodyguard of the Byzantine Emperor, coming all the way from Scandinavia, a deliberate policy as it meant they lacked political ambition and ties and were unlikely to overthrow him, being loyal to the throne itself and not the man on it. C for cataphract because I love a bit of alliteration. Byzantine heavy cavalry that charged in a wedge formation with mounted archers intermixed, designed to drive a hole in your enemy's line for your infantry to clean up. Their charge was designed to be a decisive hammer blow, however if it failed it was like overturning a truck, as their formation was extremely rigid and hard to reform, so it was advised you had a second one of these spare just in case you missed. Banjoing in the B tier is the Mamluks, elite soldiers of the Muslim world who had been taken as slaves as children and trained as warriors their entire life. By 1250 they had gained enough power to overthrow their masters the Ayyubids, become their own sultanate where they stopped the Mongol advance south and sent the Crusaders packing from the Holy Land. Also getting the B job is the Janissaries, the Ottoman Empire's secret source who were also taken as children and trained to be super duper loyal to the Sultan, where the best warriors got to be Janissaries and they were some of the first to master the early firearms. They even had spoons in their hats as their lives revolved around food, but they did eventually get too big for their boots, throwing a few tantrums and even killing a sultan who tried to disband them. Erupting in the A tier are the Crusader military orders, the Templars, the Hospitallers and the Teutonic Knights. These were the backbones of the Crusader armies in the medieval knight's wet dream. They devoted their life to God and slaying the infidel, often fighting against overwhelming odds as they refused to retreat as that was dishonourable to God, sometimes to great success, and sometimes they got absolutely slaughtered. Agincourting in the A tier is the English longbowmen, who put England on the map as an effective military force in Europe due to their great influence in victories during the 100 Years' War, and they were so effective that England armies often comprised of 75% of these buggers. I could probably put them in S tier, but I didn't want to be too biased as an English person, and they were on the receiving end of a good few French spankings if they didn't set up a defensive position properly. And sloppy topping into the S tier is the Hussites and their war wagons. A bunch of peasants who innovated with weaponry and utilised these medieval tanks to such great effect along with their legendary commander, the one-eyed Janjiska, to beat off not one, not two, not three, not four, but 5 anti-Hussite crusades. Absolute legends of the game. So who was the sexiest Renaissance warrior unit on the tier list? Flesh munching in the F tier are the Eagle and Jaguar warriors, the elite warriors of the ever-warring Aztec Empire. These boys put on their best furry suits in order to take as many captives as possible for their next human sacrifice. Unfortunately for them though, they existed at the same time as Spanish steel and gunpowder. Dangling in the D tier is the Stratioti, Balkan light cavalry who pioneered light cavalry tactics for the era, cutting off the heads of their enemies because they got paid extra per head they gave in to their hirers. They were hired as mercenaries by many European armies for their effective scouting ability and hit and run tactics. Unfortunately for them though, they don't get our juices flowing with the hard hitting needed to be above the D tier. Also getting the D is the gendarmes, French heavy cavalry who did enjoy some success in the early 16th century due to their devastating charge. But as gunpowder weaponry began to get figured out and in unison with pikes and disciplined infantry, the gendarmes were about as useful as a eunuch's cumsock. Coming in the C tier is the Janissaries, the Ottoman Empire's elite troops who enjoyed great success as their empire expanded massively. However, as the 16th century went on, they soon got way too big for their boots. As the empire expanded, more Janissaries began to be recruited, which lowered their high bar for entry and it declined their military skill greatly. They also began demanding such things such as a license to marry. Disgusting behaviour. Balling in the B tier is the Swiss pikemen, who with their reputation for invincibility revolutionised the battlefield with their pike formations. Their great success on the battlefield led to many copying them and enhancing their pike tactics, even surpassing them as the Swiss were late to adopt gunpowder weaponry and the cohesion required in order to be an effective unit in the pike and shot battlefield. Also getting the B job is Reiters, German heavy cavalry who were the first mounted units to trade the medieval lance for firearms. They fired off their pistols at enemy infantry squares and then circled back and reloaded, known as a caracole, allowing the next line to fire in turn, which caused absolute chaos. After their shots weakened their foe, they would then charge in with their swords and clean up the mess they created. However, a well-disciplined pike unit with muskets supporting it and some heavy cavalry could send them packing. Assaulting the A tier is the Spanish tercios, who took everything the Swiss pikemen did and did it better. They were one of the first to combine these pike squares with swordsmen and the new technology of handgunners, undergoing rigorous training in order to ensure they are a cohesive unit on the battlefield with immense discipline, taking the mythical status of invincibility off the Swiss due to how bloody good they were. Honourable mention to the samurai just for how much aura they had with their armour and swords. Shagging in the S tier is the Landsknecht, just raw sex appeal on the battlefield. German mercenaries also copied what the Swiss pikemen did, and also adding handgunners and swordsmen with zweihanders, giant two-handed members aiming to cleave through an opponent's pike square, and these chaps often got double pay for fighting on the dangerous front lines. They were also exempt from laws which restricted how the lower class should be dressed, so they dressed as extravagantly colourful as possible, using the battlefield as their catwalk. And of course, snuggling up to them in the S tier is the winged hussars, Polish heavy cavalry who thrived in an era which was as hostile to cavalry as possible. They also had giant members, sometimes up to 6 meters long, in order to outrange these pikemen, and they repeated their charges with immense discipline until the enemy broke. Unfortunately though, their wings didn't allow them to fly, but as they charged they made a great sound which must have been absolutely terrifying. These chaps also took part in the largest cavalry charge in history, where 3,000 of them made up a number of total 20,000 cavalry which charged at the siege of Vienna in 1683, breaking the Ottomans.